So, the last moderated discussion at this year's Impact, together with Joanna and Marta, who are here in the first row, we are leading the content of this Congress. We did our best to make it genuine, authentic, sincere, true, and original. And I really hope you enjoyed it. For the most of the Congress, we talked about how technology could improve our lives, how it could change the lives of the next generations. This is our goal here during this Congress. Now let's focus on the changes, the negative changes, which technology can provide, and how we could tackle them. So I'm a lawyer, so let's start with definition. Esther, what is fake news?
So fake news is news that has actually it's created by somebody who wants to get people to believe something different. And it's not politically right-wing, left-wing, or in the middle. It's actually fabricated. It's not real. And so there's a distinction between fake news and biased news. But today, one of the problems is that it's not just 100% lies, it's just partial lie. So that's even more difficult because you realize that some of it is true, and then you identify with that. And then what happens is you say, well, if this part is true, well, the other part must be true. And so that's how they manage to get people to believe the fake news. It's a real problem.
Okay, and I think the question to all of you, if you had one thing to improve about it, what it would be? John?
Oh, that's a tough question. I don't want to answer that question, so I'm going to answer something else instead.
Sure.
And let me just say, I'm here in my personal capacity. I'm not representing any organization or company. I think to build on top of what Esther just said, I think one of the challenges in society right now is that people are using fake news as this umbrella term, and I think some people are purposefully trying to confuse people about what it means. So there are a bunch of things that have been happening in the last year or two, certainly, and some of those are fabricated information passed off as reality. Others are politically motivated. So I guess what I want to say is, when there's incorrect information out there and people are being led to believe it, you have to start with the motivations. Why is this happening? Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's a profit motive. And this is something that's been happening, we know, on Facebook, where there are whole businesses where people just make money because they're getting people to look at these fake articles because they're salacious and they're exciting and they get people's blood boiling. But then there's the politically motivated information. And I think when you have a nation state that's trying to intervene in elections in other nation states, well, that's probably not to make the money, it's probably politically motivated. And then finally, you've got belief. And this is what allows all of these information operations to work so well, whatever their motivation is that they go viral because you're playing on someone's belief, either because you're baking in some lies amidst a bunch of truth, or because someone just doesn't know any better. And I think one of the big challenges we have, while technology can do so many good things for society, we've decentralized power and ability so much, we're in a place where we're relying on every single individual person to be an expert in everything. And that's never going to happen. So how do we get to a place where we get the benefits of this decentralization without putting the responsibility of essentially vetting every single piece of information in every single topic on each individual person?
Sure. You want to answer the last question, or you would like to?
Yeah. If you want to approach a solution, a kind of silver bullet solution, then we have to find the driving factor behind fake news. And if you look at the history of journalism and you go back to the 19th century, false information as such has been always around. Actually, part of the first stage of journalism was actually it was a gossip activity. And many of the public intellectuals from the 19th, 18th century that we admire nowadays were authors of great books about reason and reasoning were very critical about journalism in its initial stages because of that, of those falsehoods that were put into the public opinion. So the major difference nowadays, I think, is not that people are creating or intentionally fabricating news stories for political or economic reasons, but that there is this thing that Timothy Garton-Ash calls the echo chamber effect, namely that those news items get traction in a very large scale. So thanks to social media, suddenly those news items get very, very disseminated. And they actually get the impact that they wouldn't get in a non-technological media environment. So the question I would have is to the big tech companies, actually. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, there was this saying that there are useful idiots who are disseminating false news items. So the question is whether the big tech companies aren't actually fulfilling that role nowadays. So the question would be, are we able to change the algorithms based on which those news items, which are false, are actually appearing on somebody's walls? Because it's thanks to the social media companies that those news items get disseminated.
Okay, so you mentioned journalists, firstly. Secondly, technological companies. And government, like political issue. We had, a month ago, we had an election in France, and the staff of Macron prevented somehow this whole storm of fake news which targeted his campaign. How did they do that? Could you more examine this case, John?
So they were. I can't say I know all the details, but I'll tell you what I do know, which is that they were much more prepared for the. I don't even know if I want to call it fake news, but the information operations against the Macron campaign than Hillary Clinton's campaign was, or others, I'm sure, even Brexit. Yeah. Because they'd seen it. So they had a chance to think a little bit about how they would respond. Now the problem is, any political campaign is not going to be that well staffed with cybersecurity experts. You know, they're trying to use the dollars that they raise to win votes, and when you're saying actually focus on your tech infrastructure and spend money there first, that's a hard sell. So as long as campaigns are operated the way they are now, you're always going to have a small staff. So with their small staff, what they did that was intelligent was they kind of moved away from saying, we're going to protect the castle and not let anyone in, and they almost admitted it was going to happen, and instead went about creating essentially breadcrumbs to throw the attackers off the trail of real information and to make them waste time and bury them in kind of fake Gmail accounts and fake, basically they would click on links and say, and cause a phishing attack to be successful, but then basically put it down a hole so that there's nothing there and people just wasted a day or two. So they're basically just delaying the inevitable as opposed to trying to build walls.
Okay, we could assume that it requires higher level of responsibility for the journalists. And how could you, Esther and Wawrzyniec, could you elaborate more on this issue?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but I just want to say that in response to what you said, I think that there are a lot of people out there that are producing fake news because it's financially profitable. Yeah. So if you have a very sensational headline and then you have advertising that runs next to that, you're going to have a lot of people that click on it and then you're going to make money. That's a problem. And that's a specific problem, I think, on Twitter. Because anybody can post anything, unfortunately, and on Facebook too. So Google has this new thing called fact checks, third-party fact checks, where they check the news before it's posted. And also they're working on the algorithm so that when you go on Google News, you can be sure that somehow it's been checked. But I don't think that's happening on Twitter. So just think about it. You personally can go on Twitter right now and you can write something that is false and no one's going to stop you. So that's a problem. And I don't know, we're not just consumers of news anymore like we were, 20 years ago. We're also producers of news. So one of the best ways to prevent or to help people understand this is education. Education in the schools, education for the population. People need to understand where the news is coming from. And that's, I think, one of the keys to fighting the whole fake news thing.
I absolutely agree that education is the long-term solution. The challenge is that, do we have a long-term if we don't fix this sooner? And when you look at the comparisons of a fake news story that gets shared 1 million times, and the correction to that news story that gets shared 20,000 times, you see that fact-checking might not get us to where we need to be, which is why I think we really do need to go after the business model. And there needs to be more of an effort made potentially around putting payment in escrow for longer, so that essentially somebody's not figuring out how we can actually claw back essentially ill-gotten gains, money that was made off of fake news as opposed to some kind of legitimate news, or even a mistake. If someone puts out information and it was wrong and there's kind of no ill will, we have to figure out how to differentiate between that and intentional, financially motivated lies.
I think we have to look at the ecosystem and understand how it works. So in the old days, we had journalists who were producers of news. You had the newspapers who were intermediaries. That's where the name media comes from. And then you had the consumers of news. And what came with the digital era is that consumers also have the capacity to become producers. The intermediaries, which were kind of gatekeepers in terms of quality of what gets to consumers, have a limited role nowadays. They are not only under competition from the digital sector, but they are also struggling as entities, newspapers and broadcasters. So with the pressure on the business model of broadcasters and the print media, by definition, the quality of journalism has decreased and standards have decreased. But even if we impose higher standards on the producers, on the professional producers of news, so we require journalists to double-check the sources, to double-check the stories, not to pick up everything which gets viral on the internet, it doesn't mean that individual consumers won't produce new fake items, for whatever reasons, financial or political. So we need those big companies who are between the producers, either professional or non-professional, and the general consumer to be more conscious of their role, not just in the journalistic ecosystem, but in democracy as such. Because the impact that those news items get, thanks to the dissemination through digital channels, we have seen effects of that in the Brexit referendum. We have seen it in the US, to a lesser extent in France, because in France the key state actor that could have influenced that election, namely Russia, had no real interest in tilting that election, because out of 12 candidates for the presidency, 11 were Russia-friendly. That's the reason, the key reason why you haven't seen so much intervention from Russian hackers in the French election. And you're right that the Macron camp was better prepared because of everything what happened in the US and also in Britain. They could secure their own databases in a better way. They had a certain plan on how to react. And the key plan is to react immediately to new news items which are fake. You can't simply wait out and expect that those news items won't get viral. You have to react immediately.
Right.
And the big election that is ahead of us is the German election. And the German ruling party, both the ruling party and the SPD, are extremely concerned about that. They have asked experts from the US, specifically from the Democratic Party, who lost the presidential election due to fake news, to share their experiences from last year's presidential election. They have also proposed in Germany a pretty harsh law, which is imposing huge fines on tech companies if they don't stop or introduce mechanisms to stop fake news items. But I think it's, we are in a conference which is about disruption and about the perpetual motion of technology. So we'll be facing that problem with new technological developments in 1 year and 5 years also. So what we really need is a bigger consciousness also on the part of the digital industry about the impact that their development has on democracy and the way that political systems work.
Okay, so you mentioned the responsibility of tech companies, but what can we as citizens do to get more involved in sorting out facts from fabrications, like private citizens?
So I thought it was a good idea to have some kind of fine for companies that, perpetuate the fake news. But don't you wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea to have a fine for consumers that promote fake news, that write it? So, what about people that are saying things that are terrible and it spreads all over the world? Shouldn't they be responsible? Right now, there's no responsibility, right? If you write something that's fake, nothing happens to you. I don't know. I'm just wondering out loud right now.
I'm just thinking one of the challenges might be, where do you draw the line? How do you know something is fake versus there's no evidence for something? Because lack of evidence doesn't mean that it's not true.
For example, that fake news from Estonia that they were canceling Christmas because of the Muslims. That went all over the world. That was clearly fake. Whoever put that out, we know. So, that was a terrible tweet.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm just right here on stage asking you a question that is disruptive.
It's a very legitimate question. I believe actually Google had some, if I'm not wrong, had actually taken consequences against entities who were having also advertising interest with Google and cut them off from advertising for participating in schemes which were about producing fake news. So there is some leverage from the companies that they can have on non-private entities, non-private, non-citizen entities, who would be participating in that system. But the big problem I see is who is to decide what is fake and what isn't. If you put that decision into the hands of the government, then you will end up sooner or later with a government who decides, well, that kind of information which is critical towards our government is fake, so we have to eject it. So I think it's about individual responsibility. And in terms of, Kornel, your question about what we can do about as consumers, I think, well, it's a question really, is news a consumer good or is it a public good? Because consumption is about consuming. Mm-hmm. But if I want to participate in democracy as a conscious citizen, I need information about what's happening. It's not necessarily an item you want to consume.
I think that's right.
So I think we're putting a market language and a market mindset on something which is way bigger than a product.
It's a public good. There has to be agreed upon reality. Ev Williams is one of the co-founders of Twitter and then founded Medium, and he was recently quoted saying something along the lines of, the business model of the internet advertising is broken. They see that people click on train wrecks, so then they decide that everyone wants to see train wrecks. So then they just keep producing train wrecks. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that you said earlier, I'm blanking on exactly what it was, but it made me think that even if you push back immediately against fake news, against lies, they still have a positive impact for the person who put it out there because they're taking you off message, and people have a limited attention span. And if you're using up your valuable time in front of someone and in their brain, simply denying something that's clearly ridiculously untrue, that means you can't actually be talking about things that matter, and they're winning. So I think it's really hard. I think back to one of the things that I brought up at the beginning around political versus financial motivations. I think for the political motivations, you have to deal with that the way we deal with other kinds of active measures that nation states take against one another. For the financial stuff, you have to figure out how to go after the business model, whether it's some kind of fine, whether it's some kind of escrow, so people don't get access to the money that they would otherwise get, or some kind of reputation score where people will be less likely to engage with a certain source in the future if it's clearly not reliable. But I think these are hard problems, and we're just starting to have this conversation.
Yeah. If I may, want to follow up to what you said, also to what we talked about initially or before about this relationship. Is it a consumption good or is it a public good? Timothy Garton-Ash has a forceful argument for public media, state-funded public media, which sounds to me very convincing, though I am not a big supporter. You know, I initially thought that perhaps the age of public broadcasters is over. But if we assume that news is a public good, which shouldn't be totally commercialized and provided on the basis of what's clickable and what's popular, then we need a standard setter on the media market. Somebody who delivers news without bias and on very high journalistic standard and is not pressured by business conditions. And this is the role for public broadcasters, yeah? To deliver an unbiased view or an unbiased take on current political and economic developments. So perhaps the public media are coming back with a vengeance in the digital era. They are perhaps more needed nowadays than they were 10 years ago, also in our country, where they aren't exactly unbiased and apolitical these times.
So I would be a little afraid of the public media in the United States. Look who would be funding it. You know, they said there was an article just recently that said more fake news was coming out of the White House than anywhere else. So I wouldn't want to have state-funded public media. I mean, don't we have that in Russia? Isn't that what Pravda is?
What I meant is state-funded and fully independent public media, broadcasters like you have in Scandinavian countries, for example, where they are totally dependent from the government. And they are
independent of the government?
The government is forced to fund them and is not allowed to limit funding based on what they write and they don't write.
Societally
so
funded,
it's like PBS.
but not
not state, not state in the sense party funded, but funded from the public budget, but with guaranteed independence under the constitution or relative laws which apply. So it's.
Esther, you mentioned education, and you suggested that it's looking into like long-term perspective. But what can we do about education in like the short-term perspective? For example, like special programs, or what kind of education could we deliver to influence the status quo in the, for example, next 12 or 24 months?
So what I've done for the last few months is work with a group in the United States called the Newseum. The Newseum is I don't know if you're familiar, a museum of the history of news in the world, and they're proponents of the First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech, and we created a curriculum and posters that is going to be open and free for education all over the world, actually. It's in English, so, you know, it can be translated, there's no problem. It's not big, it's just 2 posters. And what the students should do, be trained, number 1, to look at the source. Where did that news come from before they even believe anything? So I think the immediate, within the next few months, is training students because of the future. Also, they talk to their parents. And, you know, hopefully they will be able to talk to their parents and say, like, where's this news coming from? I mean, one of the big sources of fake news was something called usatoday.co. So instead of having .com, it had .co. So people didn't look carefully to see, like, where did it come from, and it was fake. So that's my answer. You know, I'm in education, of course, so I'm always thinking about how to help the kids. That's, I think, a short-term solution. I think the longer term is like, I mean, everybody else. How do we make sure that they look carefully at the sources, the evidence, the different, where does it come from? Should you really believe it? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to have people think. They don't think there is no Yes, that's it.
And I would just say, in terms of educating yourselves, to the people here today, check out a recent report by Data and Society Research Institute. Put out a report about 2 weeks ago called Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online. And so media manipulation and disinformation online, it's about a 50-page report, but it really goes in depth on how these various actions have been taken and how they continue to affect us, and how we haven't yet figured out how to respond.
I think there is also educational work to be done with the news industry itself and with journalists. We as Polityka Insight are to some extent leveraging the crisis, the quality crisis in the news industry in Poland, because we are actually delivering high quality, curated analysis on political and economic events here because of all the noise that you get from the news media, which make it very difficult for decision makers, those in business and in administration, to actually make up their mind about what's happening. But we are able to deliver consistent quality because we apply early 20th century standards to our work. You feel immense pressure from the competition in order to produce and to throw into the public sphere all the news that you get. But if you check your facts and you check your sources, then half of those news items are false, or they are intentional or half-truths. So I think there is we need some kind of added digital education in the news industry. We need journalists to really go back to the drawing board and remind themselves about what their work is about, the responsibilities that they bear as disseminators of information, and that they shouldn't put news items out there simply because they have them, because many of these news items could actually be false.
So the majority of journalists today are ethical, and I teach journalism, and I can tell you what I teach is you always have to get multiple sources. You have to get both sides, and you have to quote both sides of an issue. So I think most journalists are trained like that. It's just a rare few that are trying to make money on the sensational headlines that are doing things like you described. But, I mean, the majority are doing a good job. And, I mean, if you just look at the major news organizations in all the countries, these people are, the reason they're there is because they want to do a good job informing people. Most people at heart are good and ethical. And it's just the few that are trying to fool society and make money in unethical ways. So, you know, Google had a program, and they still have this program, where they've trained thousands of journalists, just giving them extra free training. And I'm sure this is available worldwide for all journalists.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are all running out of time, so you had the possibility to listen to our distinguished guests. These are the kind of knowledge, the kind of people, the kind of ideas we want to bring to Central and Eastern Europe and to spread this knowledge across all of the region. See you in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you.